This is so amazing for following in Joe's footsteps and making Joe's dream come true.
Betty Weeder's commitment to a health and fit lifestyle.
She wasn't just a model. She was the woman whose figure seemed impossible. A waistline so small that photographers swore it had to be a trick. Betty Brosmer was on more magazine covers than Marilyn Monroe, yet she refused to play by Hollywood's rules. Behind the glamorous smiles was a woman fighting for control of her image, dodging scandals, and stepping into a world where beauty was currency and every choice could spark controversy. Was she simply the world's most famous pinup, or was Betty hiding secrets that changed the course of her life forever? Her curves became legend before the term supermodel even existed. She inspired an entire generation of pinup art, yet her name today is often overlooked in favor of the stars she once outshined. How could someone at the peak of American glamour, with a face and figure recognized around the world, manage to disappear from mainstream memory? Behind the dazzling images was a woman far more complex than the pinup image allowed. She carefully controlled how she was seen, refusing to be boxed in, refusing to let Hollywood dictate her terms. In doing so, she built both a career and a legacy that would outlast the men and magazines that tried to define her. From the start, Betty's image was her armor and her weapon. Magazines sold her as the all-American girl, yet she was never content to be just another pinup. While other models agreed to riskier shoots, Betty famously drew the line. She never posed nude, not for Playboy, not for anyone, no matter how much money was offered. In a time when the pressure on young women to expose more and do more was immense, her refusal was bold, almost unheard of, and it worked. Instead of hurting her career, it turned her into a symbol of chaste allure. Photographers dubbed her the most chaste pinup in the business, and fans couldn't get enough. Every calendar, every magazine cover, every billboard with her face only fueled the obsession further. But Betty wasn't just surviving in a cutthroat industry. She was rewriting the rules. The deeper you look, the more you realize that Betty Brosmer's story is one of contradictions. She was adored by men, but she refused to be objectified on their terms. She lived in a world of glamour, but she preferred quiet control to scandalous headlines. She built a career on appearances, but behind the scenes, she was calculating, ambitious, and determined to transform modeling into something bigger. She was both a pinup and a pioneer, both a symbol and a strategist. Her image alone wasn't the full story. It was the carefully guarded entry point to a life that would soon intersect with power, scandal, and reinvention. Betty Brosmer wasn't just modeling for cameras. She was creating a myth around herself, one that would one day collide with bodybuilding empires, courtrooms, and whispers of secret scandals. Her story starts with the impossible waist and the dazzling covers, but it doesn't end there. Behind the pinup smiles were choices that shocked her industry, shook her marriage, and forever changed the way women would be seen in fitness and media. Once you see how it all began, you'll understand why her legacy is still being debated today. Before she became the face on hundreds of magazine covers, Betty Brosmer was just a girl growing up in Pasadena, California. Born in 1929, she came of age in a world recovering from the Great Depression, where beauty wasn't supposed to be a career path. Modeling was still a niche profession reserved for department store catalogs and advertising flyers. Yet from an early age, Betty stood out. She had a unique look, delicate features paired with striking curves that hadn't yet defined her, but hinted at what was to come. By the time she was 13, she had already landed in her first printed ad, posing for Sears and Roebuck. For most kids, it was nothing more than a moment of novelty, but for Betty, it was the beginning of something much larger. That photo planted the seed of possibility. If she could appear in a national catalog at 13, what else could be within reach? Her early modeling years were nothing glamorous. They involved long hours, low pay, and endless auditions where rejection was the norm. She wasn't yet the glamorous icon the world would later obsess over. She was simply another girl trying to break into an industry dominated by East Coast agencies and big city photographers. But Betty had one advantage others didn't have: determination. She wasn't content with being just another pretty face shuffled through agencies. She studied poses, practiced her expressions in the mirror, and treated every minor shoot as if it were a cover opportunity. It was this relentless commitment that began to separate her from the pack. When she moved to New York in her teens, the real transformation began. New York was the heart of fashion and publishing, and Betty immersed herself in the culture. She networked with photographers, learned how to handle contracts, and started to appear more frequently in men's adventure magazines, pulp covers, and advertisements. In those early years, her name started appearing alongside phrases like America's Girl Next Door. In truth, she was becoming much more. Unlike many young models who let agencies dictate every move, Betty was already making decisions that protected her image. She understood, even then, that in modeling, control was power. It was also during this time that her body began to take on the legendary proportions that would define her career. Her waist grew so famously narrow that even in early shoots, photographers joked it couldn't possibly be real. Betty didn't just rely on genetics. She worked tirelessly to maintain her shape, years before fitness culture even existed. While other models smoked and starved themselves to stay thin, Betty was quietly lifting light weights, maintaining her health, and experimenting with routines that were unheard of for women in the 1940s. Without knowing it, she was laying the groundwork for a second career she wouldn't even enter until decades later. By the late 1940s, she was landing bigger gigs, appearing in mainstream magazines that reached across the United States. Her face became recognizable in department stores, her pinups were appearing in dorm rooms and barbershops, and she was inching closer to the national stage. But for Betty, modeling wasn't just about fame. She already had a plan for something bigger. She was carving out an identity that would keep her relevant, even as the industry chewed through younger faces. She wasn't going to be just a phase. She was going to be remembered. What most people don't realize is that even before she became the pinup queen of the 1950s, Betty Brosmer had already mastered the two things that would define her life: image and control. She knew how to make herself the product, how to shape what people saw, and how to hold back what she didn't want exposed. It was this quiet mastery that would soon catapult her from catalog model to cultural phenomenon. Once the 1950s began, Betty wasn't just another pretty face trying to make it. She became the face. By the early 1950s, Betty Brosmer had become the face of America's new obsession with pinup culture. Everywhere you looked, magazine racks, billboards, calendars, even pulp fiction covers, there was Betty. Her look defined the era. Wide-eyed, smiling, yet always just mysterious enough to keep fans wanting more. She wasn't Hollywood's golden blonde bombshell, in the way Marilyn Monroe was, nor the sultry rebel like Brigitte Bardot. Instead, Betty carved out a unique space. She became the wholesome pinup, sexy without being scandalous, alluring while refusing to cross her own boundaries. That balance, which so many thought would limit her, only fueled her popularity. She was proof that you could dominate the market without giving in to pressure. Her rise was fast and unstoppable. She appeared on hundreds of magazine covers, and her photos were everywhere, from corner barbershops to men's lockers overseas. Soldiers in Korea taped her pinups to their bunks. Students tucked her images inside textbooks. She became a cultural phenomenon. Though unlike many other models, Betty was as much in control of the image as the photographers who shot her. She often chose her poses carefully, avoiding anything she thought might cheapen her brand. While other models were easily convinced to push the line for more risque shoots, Betty famously turned down Hugh Hefner's offer to pose nude for Playboy. That decision shocked the industry. Playboy was becoming the most influential men's magazine in America. But Betty didn't flinch. She believed her value wasn't in exposing everything, but in leaving just enough to the imagination. The gamble worked. Her refusal to pose nude created a paradox. The more she resisted, the more people wanted her. She became known as the most sought-after chaste pinup model of her time. This label only magnified her reputation, earning her a unique status, an icon who symbolized both fantasy and unattainability. Magazines used it as a selling point, and Betty leaned into it, carefully managing the allure without ever crossing her personal line. In an industry that often consumed women and discarded them once they gave too much, Betty's strategy kept her career alive longer than almost anyone else's. Her fame was also tied to her figure, which sparked endless fascination. Her waist-to-hip ratio was so dramatic that many claimed it wasn't humanly possible. Was it corsets? Was it photo tricks? Was it just genetics? The debate itself fueled her legend. Even today, her measurements are discussed in fitness and modeling circles as an example of extreme hourglass proportions. Betty knew it. She used her figure not just as a feature, but as a trademark, something that set her apart from every other model vying for attention. Being the queen of pinups came with costs. Fame meant constant pressure, endless schedules, and a need to stay camera-ready at all times. Betty lived under scrutiny. Every pose, every choice was analyzed. Every rejection spun into rumor. Yet she carried herself with discipline and strategy, always thinking several moves ahead. Unlike many of her peers who burned out quickly, Betty was playing the long game. She wasn't just a model. She was quietly preparing for life after modeling, even as the spotlight made her one of the most photographed women in America. Betty's reign in the 1950s was a high point in her career, but it wasn't the end. Her life was about to take a sharp turn. Just as she reached her peak as a pinup queen, she met a man who would change everything, bringing her into the worlds of bodybuilding, publishing, and scandal. Joe Weider wasn't just a fitness mogul, he was a figure who came with ambition, power, and controversy. Once Betty entered his orbit, the myth of Betty Brosmer would collide with a far bigger empire than modeling had ever offered. At the height of her pinup fame, Betty Brosmer was already a household name, but her path took a surprising turn in 1961 when she crossed paths with Joe Weider. To most people, Joe was known as the father of bodybuilding. He was a publisher, promoter, and entrepreneur who had built an empire of magazines like Muscle and Fitness, Flex, and Mr. America. He helped launch the careers of bodybuilders like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Larry Scott, and countless others. But behind the glossy covers and the heavy barbells was a man with big ambitions. Betty was about to become a central part of his story. Their meeting seemed almost unlikely. Betty was America's pinup queen, while Joe was immersed in the rough, sweaty, male-dominated world of gyms and bodybuilding contests. Yet the connection was immediate. Joe saw more than just her beauty. He saw potential. He understood that Betty's appeal could help him expand his empire beyond the niche world of muscle magazines and into mainstream audiences. For Betty, Joe represented something different as well. While she had already conquered the modeling world, Joe offered her a chance to transform her career into something larger than herself. The two married in 1961, and from that point forward, Betty Brosmer became Betty Weider. But unlike many women of her time, she didn't disappear into the shadow of her husband. Instead, she used her fame, intelligence, and discipline to carve out a new role in Joe's empire. She began contributing to his magazines, not just as a model, but as a writer and editor. She penned advice columns like Body by Betty and Health by Betty, where she offered practical fitness and nutrition tips to women long before female fitness was considered a serious industry. At a time when most health magazines were written by men and catered almost exclusively to men, Betty pushed for content that spoke directly to women. This was revolutionary. While the 1960s and 70s saw women primarily marketed beauty products and diet gimmicks, Betty argued for fitness as empowerment. She was one of the first mainstream figures to tell women that lifting weights wasn't unfeminine, that exercise could be about health rather than just appearance, and that strength could be beautiful. Her voice helped open the door for women's fitness culture decades before it became the norm. In fact, many credit her as one of the co-founders of Shape magazine, which became the leading women's fitness publication in the world. Betty's role wasn't just public. Behind the scenes, she became Joe's closest advisor. While he handled the business and promotion of bodybuilding, Betty often shaped how the magazine spoke to readers, especially women. She had an instinct for language, presentation, and tone that balanced Joe's hard-selling style. This partnership turned the wider empire into something bigger than either of them could have managed alone. Still, the marriage didn't come without controversy. Joe was a powerful man with a complicated reputation. He had already been through a messy divorce, and Betty's entrance into his life stirred rumors that tabloids eagerly exploited. Critics accused her of being the cause of Joe's first marriage ending, while others whispered that she was more involved in his business dealings than she admitted. The truth was never entirely clear, but Betty never let the noise distract her. She remained poised, focused, and determined to use her position to create lasting change. What's undeniable is that Betty Brosmer's career pivot with Joe Weider turned her from a cultural pinup icon into a figure of genuine influence. She wasn't just a model anymore. She had become the First Lady of Fitness, a title she carried with pride. She had moved from posters on walls to shaping the very way women thought about health, beauty, and strength. Yet even as her reputation as a fitness pioneer grew, scandal continued to circle their marriage. Courtrooms, lawsuits, and tabloid stories were about to test the image she had worked so hard to protect. With Betty Brosmer's marriage to Joe Weider, the glamorous pinup queen entered a very different spotlight, one filled with business empires, bitter rivalries, and messy legal battles. Joe was already a controversial figure in publishing and bodybuilding. He was a self-made mogul, but he also carried the reputation of a relentless hustler, someone who bent rules and clashed with rivals. When Betty joined his world, she didn't just become his wife, she became a target of the scrutiny that always seemed to follow him. One of the earliest scandals tied to their marriage came from Joe's divorce from his first wife, Diana. Tabloids and gossip columns speculated endlessly about timelines and motives, and Betty's name was quickly dragged into the narrative. Some claimed she was the reason for the split, while others suggested Joe and Betty's relationship overlapped with the collapse of his first marriage. Much of this was fueled by rumor and sensational reporting, but it stuck. During divorce proceedings, investigators, lawyers, and even the press painted Betty as the other woman in a public drama she never asked for. Although she avoided the courtroom spotlight directly, her image, once carefully protected as chaste and untouchable, was suddenly questioned in headlines. The trouble didn't end there. Joe Weider was no stranger to lawsuits, especially from competitors in the publishing industry who accused him of shady business practices. When he was dragged into court, Betty's name often surfaced, either indirectly in testimony or directly in tabloid side stories. Private investigators were reportedly hired to dig into their personal lives. Allegations surfaced, some suggesting affairs, others hinting at financial impropriety. Most of these claims were never proven, but in the gossip-driven world of 1960s media, proof mattered less than the scandal itself. For Betty, it was a harsh reminder that her pinup reputation couldn't shield her from the fallout of Joe's empire. What makes this chapter of her life striking is how she handled it. While many women in her position would have retreated from public view, Betty refused to vanish. She continued appearing in Joe's magazines, writing her fitness columns, and presenting herself as the composed, forward-thinking face of female health. She knew the headlines couldn't be fully controlled, but she also knew she could control her response. She offered no public meltdowns, no dramatic defenses, just a calm presence that allowed her to quietly weather the storm. Even as whispers followed her, Betty remained a constant by Joe's side, reinforcing the image of a power couple determined to outlast the scandals. Over time, many of the accusations faded into the background, replaced by the undeniable reality of what they built together. Yet the scars of that era never fully disappeared. For those who remembered the courtroom drama, Betty Weider was not just the First Lady of Fitness, but also a woman who had survived one of the most public and speculative character attacks of her generation. The irony is that while Betty's early career had been built on controlling her image and staying above controversy, her marriage thrust her into controversies she couldn't always avoid. But it was precisely her calm, disciplined approach that allowed her to come through it stronger. As the legal drama died down, Betty began reshaping her public persona once again, not as a scandalized wife, but as a pioneer who would redefine how women approached health and strength. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Betty Brosmer had undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in pop culture history. Once the impossible waist pinup adored by soldiers, students, and magazine collectors, she was now stepping into a new identity, the First Lady of Fitness. It was a role few could have predicted, yet in many ways it was the natural extension of the discipline and control she had always carried with her. The glamorous posters may have defined her past, but her future was about substance, helping women see health and strength as more than just a reflection in the mirror. Betty threw herself into the fitness publishing world with Joe Weider, not as a silent partner, but as an active voice. She began writing columns that reached millions of readers, with names like Body by Betty and Health by Betty. These weren't fluff pieces or recycled advice. She gave practical, thoughtful tips at a time when women were fed little more than fad diets and beauty tricks. She explained nutrition in simple terms, promoted the idea that women could exercise with weights, and argued that real health wasn't about starving yourself, but about building strength. Decades before fitness influencers and Instagram trainers, Betty was pushing a message of empowerment. Her involvement grew deeper when she helped shape magazine, which quickly became the most influential women's fitness magazine in the world. With Betty's touch, it blended credibility with accessibility, offering workouts, diet advice, and personal stories that spoke directly to women in a way the male-driven fitness industry never had before. She gave female readers permission to take up space in gyms, to think of themselves as athletes, and to prioritize health over appearances. It was a radical shift, and Betty's fingerprints were all over it. Her reinvention wasn't only about writing. She also became a spokesperson and advocate, using her image to show that fitness and femininity weren't opposites. While stereotypes insisted that women who lifted weights would lose their femininity, Betty embodied the opposite. She was living proof that strength and beauty could coexist, and she used her platform to chip away at those outdated ideas. Fitness experts today often trace the roots of women's modern exercise culture back to her columns, her public appearances, and her determination to be more than just a cover model. What's remarkable is how seamlessly Betty transitioned her identity. The same woman who once dominated the pinup industry managed to distance herself from that world without ever disowning it. She embraced her past but refused to be defined by it. While others of her era faded into obscurity, Betty evolved, staying relevant by moving with the times instead of fighting against them. In many ways, her life became an example of reinvention itself, a lesson in how to control not just your image but your destiny. By the 1980s and 90s, Betty Whiter was seen less as a pinup relic and more as a pioneering figure in the women's fitness movement. Her voice carried weight in an industry that had long ignored women, and her advice outlived the scandals and rumors of earlier decades. She had gone from posters on walls to pages in fitness magazines, and finally, to being remembered as the woman who helped reshape how society thought about women's health. Betty's story wasn't just about beauty or scandal. It was about survival, adaptation, and vision. She proved that reinvention wasn't just possible, it could be powerful. Even as she stepped back from the spotlight later in life, her influence lingered in every gym, every magazine rack, and every woman who realized she didn't have to choose between beauty and strength. Betty Brosmer may have started as the impossible waste, but by the end, she had built a legacy that was very real and impossible to erase. For all the glamour, discipline, and reinvention, there has always been one lingering question about Betty Brosmer. How much of her story was carefully crafted image, and how much was the real Betty? Even her age has been a subject of debate. Official records, such as census data, place her birth year in 1929. Yet throughout her modeling career, Betty often claimed she was younger, sometimes shaving off as many as 6 years. Some sources listed her as being born in 1935, a discrepancy that turned into a whispered controversy among fans and reporters. Was it a simple mistake, a studio's marketing tactic, or a deliberate choice to keep her youthful image alive longer? No one ever got a definitive answer, and Betty herself never seemed eager to clarify. The age dispute might seem trivial on the surface, but in the mid-20th century, it was a serious matter. For women in entertainment and modeling, age could make or break careers. A difference of even 5 years might decide whether a model was considered fresh and marketable or past her prime. If Betty did play with the numbers, it wasn't vanity, it was survival. By protecting her age, she protected her market value. Considering her career outlasted countless peers who faded quickly, the strategy worked. Still, it added to her reputation as someone who was always in control of what the public knew and what it didn't. There were other secrets too, or at least persistent rumors. Some fans speculated about how she maintained her extreme hourglass figure, with theories ranging from tight corsets to surgery to simple genetics. Betty always insisted it was natural, supported by discipline, diet, and fitness. Others whispered about her relationship with Joe Weider during his first marriage, with tabloids eager to frame her as the scandalous other woman. Again, none of these accusations were ever proven, but the cloud of speculation only deepened the sense that Betty's life was as carefully staged as one of her photo shoots. But perhaps that was the point. Betty Brosmer built her career on being seen, yet she revealed only what she wanted to. Her control over her image was so absolute that decades later, fans are still piecing together what was fact and what was branding. Unlike many of her peers who burned out in public scandals, Betty emerged from controversy intact, her mystique only enhanced by what she never confirmed. In the end, the unanswered questions became part of her legacy. This delicate balance between what was real and what was curated may be the most fascinating part of her story. She lived at the intersection of myth and reality, where the truth mattered less than the image she projected. Was she a woman hiding secrets, or simply a master at guarding her private life? The ambiguity kept her relevant long after her modeling days were over. It left her fans with one last puzzle. Was Betty Brosmer the ultimate pinup, or the ultimate strategist? What's certain is that the mystery itself helped preserve her place in history. By never fully clarifying the contradictions, Betty ensured that people would still be talking about her long after her last photo shoot. In a way, the secrets became her final act of control. When you step back and look at Betty Brosmer's journey, it's clear that she was never just a pinup, never just a pretty face frozen on glossy magazine covers. She was a strategist, a survivor, and a pioneer who managed to reinvent herself in ways that most of her peers never could. She went from the impossible waistline that defined an era of beauty standards to the pen that guided millions of women toward fitness, strength, and self-respect. Her story is not one of a woman who faded when the cameras stopped flashing. It's the story of someone who refused to be trapped in a single chapter. What makes her story even more compelling is the duality she embodied. On one hand, Betty represented the fantasy of mid-century America, a flawless icon who seemed untouched by scandal or time. On the other, she lived in a world filled with rumor, speculation, and real controversy, much of it tied to her marriage and the empire she helped build with Joe Weider. She managed to survive courtrooms, tabloid whispers, and industry pressures without losing her composure or control. In an era that devoured young models and discarded them at the first sign of age, Betty outmaneuvered the system. She showed that control over image, over narrative, over identity was the most powerful tool of all. And yet, even now, questions linger. How old was she really during her peak years? How much of her private life was carefully curated to protect her brand? Did she consciously build myths about herself? Or were those myths simply the product of an industry hungry for larger-than-life figures? Those mysteries may never be solved, and perhaps that's the point. The gaps, the contradictions, the secrets, they're part of what has kept her fascinating long after her time in front of the camera ended. Betty Brosmer was not just photographed, she staged her own legend. Her legacy continues in unexpected ways. Modern fitness culture, women's health movements, even the body-positive debates of today can trace roots back to Betty's insistence that strength and femininity could live together. She was one of the first to say that exercise wasn't just for men, that women deserved to feel empowered in their own bodies. While her figure may have sparked endless debates about beauty standards, her voice carried a different message, that health, discipline, and self-control were what really built a lasting legacy. So who was Betty Brosmer? Was she the world's most famous pinup, the icon of an impossible body? Or was she the first lady of fitness, the strategist who outlasted scandal and reshaped an industry? The truth is, she was both, and more. She was a woman who understood that image could be power, but reinvention could be freedom. That is why, decades later, her story still matters. Because Betty Brosmer wasn't just a symbol of her time, she was a woman who saw beyond it. If you found Betty's incredible journey as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories of forgotten icons who shaped history. Drop a comment below and let us know, did Betty Brosmer deserve more recognition than she got, or was her quiet legacy exactly what she wanted? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.